Welcome back to the Alec Lewis Show. I am your host, Alec Lewis. This is episode 60. We made it to 60 leading up to the Combine. I appreciate you guys being here. If you don't know me, I cover the Vikings for The Athletic. Today's guest is a guy who pours a lot into the draft. His name is Fran Duffy. He covers the draft for the All City Network, also does some work covering the Eagles for PHLY. He has an awesome draft guide on the Die Hard Network. So it is an interactive draft guide, rankings of players, full overviews of all the guys, like every player, their attributes and all that. So you can go check that out. The link will be in the description. Got into a lot of Vikings draft conversation specific to certain players, really validating to get a feel for certain guys. So I hope you all enjoy it. As always, this show is presented by First Resource Bank. That's a member FDIC bank in the local area. Great people run that thing, and Tim Siegley, Aaron Siegley, and Charlie Anderson. My branch is over on Washington near the Trader Joe's. Christy at the front desk helps me out. Their online banking is phenomenal, so please go check them out. The information on their local branches is down below. You guys will not be disappointed with First Resource Bank's banking platform. Always appreciate their support. Got some stories over at The Athletic, previewing the Combine, a Sam Darnold story about the options with him from a tag perspective, and much more to come next week. I mean, we'll talk with Adofo-Mensah, Kevin O'Connell, and then a lot of agents and people in the industry. So really looking forward to bringing you kind of what I hear on the ground in Indianapolis next week. Stay tuned for that. Without further ado, here's a draft-heavy conversation with Fran Duffy of the All City Network. Fran, thanks for hopping on the show. How you doing, man?
Alec, I'm doing great, man. It's look, we're recording this the week before our trip to Indianapolis, so it's a great time of year, and I'm excited to get out there and get eyes on really the entire draft class. You know, I've been down to the Shrine Bowl, been down to the Senior Bowl, so I've been able to see like chunks of it here and there, but being able to see all these guys, it always makes for a good week.
How many combines have you been to?
My first one was 2011. And I don't think I've missed any. Yeah, I don't think I've missed any. So I guess this would be my 14th, or I guess it would be my 15th. So yeah, it's been a bunch, but it's a great trip.
The week is relentless, and like I don't know for you, but for me, it'll be my, I guess, third now. I mean, the nights are late, the conversations are relentless. I mean, you're just like, for people who don't know, it's like you're just walking through hotels, seeing people you either know or should introduce yourself to or whatever, and it's kind of it's a gauntlet, but it's fun. I'm looking forward to being there. I wanted to talk to you because I know you have put in the work, and like you can see it on All City. Like, your draft guide is very interactive. It's very easy to read, to look at, and I know, just having like followed you for the time that I have in covering this league, like, you do watch the tape. You're very invested in terms of getting it right. And that's why I wanted to talk. I want to start with, how many guys have you watched, and what is your process when you are formulating some of the overviews within your draft guide?
I appreciate it. As we sit here today, I have done 173 films. Actually, no, 174. 174. And so I'm hoping that number will be, we'll get north of 250. I would hope by the time we get to draft weekend. It's something that I've always had a passion for. You and I, we both know Dane and the work that he does, and it's funny. Like, Dane and I have talked about this. He and I both fell in love with the draft the same year, the 1999 draft, where Tim Couch went number 1 to the Cleveland Browns. Dane grew up a Cleveland Browns Cleveland guy, and then Donovan McNabb went number 2 to the Eagles in that draft. And here locally in Philadelphia, the debate was Donovan McNabb versus Ricky Williams. Who should they take? And I remember just like getting so caught up in that conversation that I was like, oh, like the draft is cool. Like the Eagles were terrible at that point. But like, oh, it's, I want to learn more about like this whole draft process. And from there, it just kind of took off. And so like, I think I started writing reports when I got to college, when I got to Temple University. And so I started writing for a fantasy football website when I was there, then started working for the football team and started to learn how to watch film, and just have been writing reports ever since. So that was the spring of 2005. And so being able to now share that publicly with All City and all of our networks, it's been a very fun year to be able to do that.
Let me ask, just because I'm curious, like you're watching, and we don't need to talk quarterbacks because the Vikings have theirs and J.J. McCarthy, but like you're watching a Shador or a Cam Ward or a Jackson, like how many tapes do you feel like you have to get at which, okay, I now feel comfortable with what I'm seeing? Or is it ever you're fully comfortable? Is it early on? Like all you have to watch is 50 plays and you feel like you got to feel like, where are you? And does that change? Like as I watch some of these guys, there are times where I feel like, okay, I've watched the game. I feel like I have a fairly good feel. This guy makes me feel like I'm energetic to watch more. And I feel like that's a good quality. Like, where are you? And how do you think about that process?
Yeah, it definitely changes by position, and it can change by player, because there are some guys where, to your point, like I'll be on the 6th game and I'll be like, man, like I still don't have like a great, I don't feel like super confident in it. One of my, the things I like to say is like understanding the limitations of the film, right? And understanding like the whys behind things. I'm a big believer in, not letting what I see on film, like define the motivations behind a player, right? So being able to talk with guys and talk through their process and, hey, what happened on this play? What were you thinking with this throw or with this decision? That's one of the things I love about going to the All-Star games, going to the Combine, and being able to ask those guys those individual questions, in a one-on-one setting. That's always valuable. But for me, quarterback, like, I mean, at least 8 tapes I'd like to be able to get through in totality, at least 8. But look, it's also I can't watch 250 guys 8 games a pop, right?
Yeah.
So as a one person deal, that makes it tough. So you gotta have to pick and choose your battles. And some guys you just have to put more film and more time into than others. But quarterback is definitely one that is very time intensive. The way I look at it though, too, Alec, is that like I try and approach it. I'll watch 2 or 3 games at a time.
Sure.
And then I'll come back a few weeks later and I'll watch a couple of, like 2 or 3 more games and then 2 or 3 more games. And then what'll then happen is when I get to like this part of the calendar, now it's all right, I've got the full season's worth of tape. Let me watch all of his dropbacks on 3rd down. Let me watch all of his pressures. Let me watch all of his turnover-worthy plays. You get into like those kind of situational things, and that can be valuable once you get into like post-Super Bowl type of evaluation process.
That's awesome. And the folks listening to this know the Vikings are probably going to be in the market for interior defensive line, interior offensive line, running back, and cornerback. And how free agency goes will probably dictate the positions that we really key on in the draft. But as you hear me mention those as positions of need for an NFL team with this upcoming draft, I mean, how do those needs match with what is available in this year's draft in your mind?
Well, so a couple come to mind right off the bat. I mean, defensive tackle and running back, this draft is chock full of talent. When I look at how many players are going to Indianapolis, I usually kind of use that as a gauge for overall depth in a class and how scouts, how the league ultimately views the depth in a class. And I'm pretty sure the number is 40. I did a piece last week for All City, that just went through all the Combine announcements and just looked at the number of players invited and comparing that to years past and like the average number of players drafted at each position. That number at defensive tackle is exorbitantly high. Now, offensive line, it's down a little bit, right? But I think you look at running back, you look at tight end, those numbers are higher this year than normal. So I think when you look at a couple of those positions that you laid out, I think the Vikings are in good shape. But there is a difference though, and that's what, when people talk about, like this draft is really strong in this area.
Sure.
Sometimes people are only talking about that when it comes to round 1 and not necessarily like the depth overall. Like there's a lot of receivers going. I think it's like 10 more than last year going to, but no one would compare the talent at the top of last year's receiver draft where you had Marvin Harrison, you had Neighbors, you had Adunze, to what is available here this year, right? And so it really does come down to how you define, the depth and the strength of a class. But there's no question, defensive tackle, loaded this year. Right? No matter what area of the draft you're looking, no matter what type you're looking for, you're going to find it here in this class. And then same at running back. I mean, obviously, you got the guy at the top with Ashton Genty, but when you look at the next tier and those guys, Marion Hampton and Travion Henderson, you look at Caleb Johnson at Iowa, you look at Quinshon Judkins, another Ohio State back. You get to that next tier. Okay, these are guys that are potentially round 1 or early stages of day 2, and then you get to day 3, and you're like, man, there's a bunch of guys that I have a lot of juice for, and so I think the Vikings are in a good spot in round 1, but then also just in totality in this draft. They should have plenty of talent at positions of need.
I wanted to start with the defensive tackles and get in the weeds a little bit because I've watched a lot of these guys, the names that I think people have at the top, and then some of the ones that are interesting, like in Omar Norman Lott from Tennessee. I'll ask about him, but I know you like him, and watching him and listening to others, like I can understand it. But to get in the weeds, I mean, the 3 players that really intrigue me as I'm thinking about the Vikings at number 24 with the interior of the defensive line are Ole Miss's Walter Nolan, Michigan's Kenneth Grant, and Oregon's Derek Harmon. And I have my own thoughts on all 3 of these guys, but I've said this on the podcast before. Like, I've heard Brian Flores in this front office with Flores as the DC talk about wanting big guys on the front who move like little guys. And I know they were interested in Byron Murphy last year from Texas. I think Kalijah Cansey a couple years ago was intriguing to them. Can you describe how you sort through those 3 and Nolan, Harmon, Kenneth Grant, how you think about those guys, who maybe you're higher on than consensus, or why? Because I have my opinions on them, but I'm just curious as someone who's probably watched more than I have.
Yeah, for me, the guy at the top of that trio would be Walter Nolan. And I think when you look at his traits overall, his ability to get off the ball, his get off is really impressive. So you have that first step quickness. He can win, off the snap that way. But then he also has power. He can push the pocket. He can win with his hands at the top of the rush. He can win with effort late in the down. He's got the anchor to be able to hold his ground at the point of attack. Now, the consistency, not quite always there, but I do think if you're someone that says, like, all right, like, here are the flashes with this guy. He was a former big-time recruit. He came on this year at Ole Miss after starting his career at Texas A&M, played there 2 years, and the tape was middling, I would say. Like, it was fine, but nothing special. This year, he really turned it up a notch for Ole Miss and that defensive front, and he was unblockable at times. A guy that as soon as I turned on the tape, I said, okay, like, this guy is a top 20 talent in this draft. And I think that was clear after watching him and then seeing him up close in Mobile a few weeks back. I thought that he showed some really good flashes, especially early in the week. And what I also liked about it too, Alec, I think when you look at a lot of the players down there in Mobile, hey, you have a good day at practice. Maybe by Wednesday, we're checking out. All right, we'll see you guys later. We're packing our bags. And then that happened with a number of players here this season. Walter Nolan was there, Thursday's practice, even though he got dinged up and had to leave practice on Wednesday. He actually gutted it out. He ended up having to leave practice again on Thursday. But the fact that he was even out there, that showed a little something to me. I think when you look at Nolan, his traits, his upside, kind of give me the edge for him over the other 2. When you look at Harmon and Grant, I think that really it comes down to 2 sides of the coin, right? Because both guys are built a little similarly when you're looking at like probably like a pure nose tackle type, as opposed to Nolan, which I think he's like an upfield penetrator type. I think when you're looking at those 2, Kenneth Grant is a big body, only a 1-year starter. Didn't start until this year, but I mean, he was on Bruce Feldman's freak list over there with the Athletic before he played it down at Michigan. Like, they were buzzing about him when he got there that first spring. And I think when you see that on film, he's got those dancing bear qualities. He's got really light feet. So, he fits that mold of big guy who moves like a little guy. I would say that the ball production is not quite there at the level that I would like for defensive linemen. I'm a big believer in production carrying over on the defensive side of the football. When you look at the front 7, the guys that are constantly around the ball, that typically is something that can carry over. And Grant didn't quite hit that benchmark in my eyes, whereas Nolan, I think, did. I think when you look at Derek Harmon, he's a little bit different as well. Where Harmon, he started his career at Michigan State, was heavy, was not always around the ball. He transfers to Oregon this year, goes to that scheme, and for all intents and purposes, like trimmed down, lost weight, looked quicker, and was around the ball much more often this year for a really good Oregon defense and for that defensive front, and really turned it up. So, to me, I think that Grant, the upside is probably higher there. I think I feel a little bit better about Harmon, but I would put them both in that same bucket. And this is one of the things I love about going to the combine, though, is that I think, they're going to be going back to back in drills, right? And so I'm going to be, on Thursday afternoon next week, I'm going to be sitting in that lower bowl watching the position drills, and it'll be like great. It'll just be great to see Kenneth Grant and Derek Harmon go through all of that stuff back to back to back, and just get a sense of like, all right, like who moves a little bit better for the guys that size? Because I'm a big fan of watching the positional workouts and being able to go apples to apples that way. I hope both of them work out. And we'll get a sense of, who just, because that's where the combine really comes into play, right? Is that ability to break up those clusters and help you tier guys out in those chunks of players.
The two things I want to say is, like, as I was watching Kenneth Grant, and I think he's listed around like 340. Like, I'm like, and this is bad to say, maybe I shouldn't like have this but like, I'm like wanting him to be Dexter Lawrence. Like I as I watch him, I'm like, with that side, like, could you just really push the pot? And I mean, like, that's just me being a fan of football. Like, it would be awesome if that guy turned it. And then the other thing I wanted to say is with Derek Harmon, he was near the top of the charts in all of PFS pass rush win rate and pressures per snaps. And then I watched the film and I'm like, I don't know if I necessarily feel that level of pass rush production that I'm seeing in the numbers. And that to me was just pretty interesting. I don't know if you relate to that at all, but I just that's just kind of how I looked at it and specifically with him, because like, I know this front office and the general manager, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, is very analytically inclined. And I know that they have, like, the pass rush win rate, pressure rate, like, that stuff matters to them. And so with Derek Harmon, I imagine the interest is going to be there. But then I watch it and I'm like, I don't know if I necessarily feel the Walter Nolan just like violence explosion that you feel watching him on tape. That was interesting to me.
Yeah, I thought that Grant's movement skills were probably a little bit better than Harmon's. I think Harmon, his game was more built off of like power, the ability to push the pocket and kind of collapse in that way. That's where I thought a lot of his pressures came. But from a movement standpoint, like I thought he was fine. I thought it was solid, but nothing where I was like, oh man, like, and that's where. For me, if I'm taking a defensive tackle that high, like I think he's got to have that level of juice, right? And that's where I've always kind of balked a little bit at Harmon going as high as people had him in mock drafts. We'll say like November, where people were talking about him in the top 20. I don't know if I can quite get there just because of exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah. I mentioned before I asked you about those three, Omar Norman Lott, who is a Tennessee defensive tackle. He's like built lower to the ground, but he's also a guy from the metrics who just, is off the charts in terms of pass rush win rate, pressure rate. What do you like as much as you do about him?
I mean, that guy's got legit juice. Like, and it pops off the film as soon as you turn it on. He's going to threaten edges immediately for interior linemen. He's got that ability to get into the backfield. You talk about some of those win rate metrics. 21.4% pressure rate last year. So like one thing I typically do, Alec, is I keep track of a lot of these metrics for a lot of players, and it's all position specific. And sometimes I look at it over the course of his career, and then also like, all right, what did you do in your last season? The highest of any defensive tackle that PFF charted that was drafted in the last decade, that pressure rate, the highest for an interior guy was 19.1. His was 21.4. So you're talking like a big jump. That's a couple percentage point jump from the next highest over the last decade. This guy was living in the backfield. Now the big thing is sample size does come into play. It was only a 4-game starter over the course of his career. Norman Lott, was not a guy that was an every week starter, but Tennessee's defensive line was loaded. I mean, they've got a lot of talent, not just for this class, but for next year's class, the year after that. So they played, it was like hockey line changes constantly with that group. So, you'll give him a little bit of grace there. But this is a guy that's constantly changing the line of scrimmage. I love that first step explosiveness, extremely productive on a down-by-down basis. I talked about how much I value that. So it wasn't just, oh, man, like he's quick off the ball, and so that like juiced up the win rate stuff. It was also like he was able to get to the ball as well. I mean, 4 TFLs, 4 sacks this past year on just just under 230 snaps played. So with 13 hurries on top of it. So I think when you're looking at Norman Lott, maybe you're taking a gamble. Like maybe he's not a pure 3-down player, and that's why I don't think you're hearing about him in the first round. But I think when you're getting into day 2, like the Eagles took Milton Williams a couple years ago in the middle of the third round, and Milton was just a dynamite player for them. Really, honestly, from Jump Street, and he was a role player early, as a backup, and then even he didn't become a real like every down player until year 3, year 4 of his contract. And obviously, we saw what he did in the Super Bowl. But that's the kind of player I think when you're looking at Omar Norman Lott that he can be, and he can develop into that down the road. That's
pretty awesome. Are there any other guys in that defensive tackle mix that are really interesting to you? Like I watched TJ Sanders from South Carolina, and to me, like there was some pass rush juice with him. Now I don't know. I mean, in terms of size to hold up against the run, I don't know about pass rush moves and how much his arsenal really has. I mean, I just wonder if there are other guys that you think about. Whether probably not at the top, but whether it's 3rd round, 4th round guys who just intrigue you on the interior defensive line.
For me, it would be Darius Alexander from Toledo. And just going down to the Senior Bowl, he was one of the most impressive players down there on a day-to-day basis in practice. Took one of the highest volume of one-on-one reps that I've seen from a defensive lineman. He was just constantly like put his hand up. Yep, I'm ready to go back in. And honestly, like reps against centers couldn't block him. Reps against guards, he was too athletic. They couldn't block him. He would go out to play defensive end against offensive tackles. They couldn't block him. When he was coming at him with a runway, he was able to win with power. He can win with quickness. He's reminiscent. I'm not saying he's this player, but he's reminiscent in terms of like his body type and his quickness of like a Chris Jones body type. You look at his long arms, 34-inch arms at 6'3.5", 304 pounds. So he's tough to get a hand on. Another freak list athlete, really smooth and fluid. I think when you're looking at him, he's a guy that I think a week from now, they'll be taking the field, 1 week and 3 hours from now, right? I think that he's a player that I think that we'll be talking about 8 days from now. Is like, oh, this is a big winner from Indianapolis.
Toledo. I mean, I don't like Quinyon Mitchell last year, and we met at the Senior Bowl, and he blew that thing out of the water. I remember. After one of the practices early, Brian Flores went out on the field and talked to Quinyon Mitchell afterward. And I know they really liked him, and it's great to say now it'd be nice to have him for a team that needs a bunch of cornerbacks. But Toledo, wow, it's pretty impressive. I want to hop over to the running backs because I've watched Hampton, Judkins, Henderson, Johnson, Martinez, Woody Marks, R.J. Harvey, DJ Giddens, Dylan Sampson, ETN. I mean, stacking these guys is you're doing the Lord's work trying to do it because there's just so much talent. But I want to start with the top tier, similar to how I did with the defensive tackle, and just contrast the three guys kind of near the top: Omarion Hampton, Caleb Johnson, Travion Henderson. I mean, I will tell you, I watched Hampton like maybe 3 tapes last week, and I kind of had to stand out of my chair. I was like very impressed with this guy. I haven't seen as much Caleb Johnson. And then Travion Henderson, I was watching him. There's a play against Penn State where I think he's like a run blocker on the edge, and he just blows this guy up down the field. It was very impressive. But how do you contrast those 3 guys? Maybe it doesn't have to be stacking them up. Just how do you think about their differences?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think they all do have it's pretty clear differences in terms of like play style and what their best usage might be in the NFL. I think with Hampton, he's your classic like foundation sustaining type running back, right? I mean, you're talking 5'11", 3/4, 219 pounds. We'll get the official measurements a week from now, but this is a guy that excels through contact. He's strong. He's powerful. He's a hard-nosed ball carrier, like downhill between the tackles, really decisive. He does an outstanding outstanding job of just playing through contact consistently. You know, one of the things that I'll look at is just like the yards after contact. 74.2% of his yards came after contact. That is a huge number from this past season. Over 4 yards after contact per attempt. Also an impressive number over the course of the year. So I think when you're looking at Hampton, you kind of know what you're going to get. Yeah, I do think that he's got 3-down ability because he's got really soft hands, really confident at the catch point, good eyes in pass pro, and he's, again, really strong on contact. Some things to clean up from a technique standpoint, but the 1-2 is there. And so I think when you're looking at Hampton, you know, I saw shades of like what David Montgomery has been in the NFL. And so I think if that's what he becomes, yeah, I think you're talking about him as a late round 1, early round 2, you know, type of player. Would not shock me if that's where he went off the board. And so I think that's how I kind of view Hampton. Then when you look at Henderson, he's more of a diminutive build, right? You know, 5'10", 208 pounds. Again, we'll get the official measurements with him next week, but a ton of work over the course of his career. I mean, he's a 4-year player for the Buckeyes. I remember his college debut against Minnesota, against the Gophers.
Wow.
And it was electric. Like, get him the football, and I think it was like a little screen to the flat, and he just like put his foot in the ground and went, and it was a big play to the house. And this was he was a 5-star kid, and I was like, all right, like now we're gonna hear from this guy for the next 3 years. And he ended up getting dinged up consistently over the course of his career, missed multiple games every single season on campus until this year when they brought in a big time transfer in Quinshon Judkins, and those guys kind of platooned together. And so that's where when I look at Henderson, I kind of wonder, all right, is he going to be kind of shoehorned into that kind of role where maybe he is more Robin than Batman? You know, does he need to be that kind of a player? But I mean, otherwise, I'm watching. I'm like, all right, this guy's got juice. He's got lateral quickness. He sets things up in the hole really well. He's really good in space. He's got good hands. He can run the full route tree, out of the backfield, and then they'll split him out wide and run double moves with him. Team captain. You talked about the lead block, out of the backfield and him getting after people. So, I think that you just feel really good about his floor. With me, I wonder, like, all right, like, what is the ultimate ceiling with Henderson? What is his role ideally in an NFL offense? You know, maybe if he's a great number 2, then, I think that does kind of cap, like, all right, maybe he doesn't go, in round 1. But I think that's going to be an interesting discussion that teams are going to have. I think when you look at Caleb Johnson, he's more of like your big, explosive, hard charging, like outside zone stretch runner. You look at 6 foot 225. I mean, he is a horse to bring down. I was talking to the Iowa linebacker Jay Higgins down at the Shrine Bowl, and I was just like, what was this guy like going up against in practice? And he's like, he's a John Deere. Like, he's just so tough to get to the ground, and then he's got that juice to be able to get to the edge and pull away. In those big moments. And so I think when you're looking at Caleb Johnson, again, like decisive, trusts his blocks, good contact balance, but he also has that juice to be able to like eat up grass, get through the hole, and then break away in space. So he's kind of like that blend between a little bit what we saw from Hampton, a little bit what we saw with Henderson. I think he's a little bit scheme specific, in terms of like I kind of want him, on like that stretch zone scheme. I could see like a Kyle Shanahan, a Sean McVay. Like he's a little bit of like Todd Gurley-ish, not quite as loose. He's probably a little bit tighter. I wrote down Tank Bigsby when I was watching him as well. So kind of reminded me a little bit of Bigsby when he was at Auburn. He ended up being a late 2 or an early 3 to Jacksonville. So I think when you're looking at all 3 of these guys, they've got RB1 type of potential. Just depends on what you want.
Yeah, the TreVeyon Henderson question is interesting, and the people listening to this and Vikings fans in general, I mean, they have a front row seat to seeing what Jahmyr Gibbs can do on a yearly basis. And I mean, I say the people listening, but the Viking staff as well. But I mean, the thing with Jahmyr Gibbs, I don't know how he stacks up, but even that Detroit team had been built a certain way to the point at which they then made that selection on Jahmyr Gibbs. And I think the hard part or the hard sell locally to people here would be like, is the offensive line where it needs to be to then do that type, to make that type of pick? Is the interior defensive line strong enough? I mean, having just watched Philadelphia do what they did all season, but in the Super Bowl, like, is that built up enough? Is the cornerback group strong enough to be able to make that type of pick? I mean, I think that's where that selection and a running back even in general in round 1, I mean, that's where I think it becomes difficult for people, but it will be a conversation that is relevant to have. With the corners, I haven't watched a ton of these guys. I mean, there's Travis Hunter, obviously, and we don't need to discuss him because he will be long gone. But like, how do you see that group? Are there any guys that just, if I mention the Brian Flores defense, that he has not really played in Minnesota, but if I go back to Miami where it's just press man heavy, long arms, can run, like are there any guys that you feel like fit that profile?
Yeah, one guy that stands out to me right off the bat would be Siobhan Revel from ECU. 6'1.5", 188 pounds, so a little bit light, but really long arms, over 32.5-inch arms. This guy is a definite press man skill set with his frame, his speed. He looks like a 4.3 type athlete. The big thing is he tore his ACL, or he had a season-ending knee injury, I should say, back in practice in late September. And so, how healthy is he? Can you count on him moving forward? I will say, like, one of the things I do, Alec, like in this process is it's not just about like evaluating the players, but I also keep track of like trends with all 32 teams, try and listen to as many like head coach, GM press conferences, try and find trends, with all of these guys. And it helps when you're doing like mock drafts and things of that nature. In Minnesota, look, under Kwesi, they've probably taken more gambles than I would have expected, coming in. And I think it's one of those things where, a lot of people think of, like, analytics, they're going to go to the safe route. I think with Kwesi, I think the big thing is like, all right, where can we buy the dip on players, right? Well, where can we find bargains on guys?
No
so
question.
One of the things is trying to find like, some of these red flag players that maybe other people are passing on. If Siobhan Revel was healthy, he's probably not on the board when the Vikings pick, right? And so I think that he's a guy that, if he is there late in round one, as long as the medical checks out next week in Indianapolis, I think that's one that could be really interesting to fit that Brian Flores scheme.
It's interesting because people here have such like a love-hate, I think, with that. I mean, some of the red flag injury type players. It's like you have the 2022 NFL draft, where they selected Andrew Booth Jr., who had a ton of injuries coming out of Clemson and did not pan out, obviously. And there are a bunch. I mean, Marcus Davenport was a free agent signee that barely played. But then you have last year's free agent period where you signed a bunch of guys who had dealt with injuries, and Jonathan Grenard and Andrew Van Ginkel, Blake Cashman. I mean, there were a lot of guys that had been through injuries over the course of their career that played huge roles on a defense that helped and really kind of led the charge for a 14-win team. So it's very interesting. One more running back I wanted to hit on that I didn't. A guy that you have higher that I haven't watched any of is Bashal Tutin. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Virginia Tech running back. I mean, he's not a name among the list of like 20 that I have done a ton of work on, but what intrigues you about him?
Really impressive balance to stay alive mid-run. He was a track guy in high school that, with reported test times that were like in the 4.3s. I don't see that. Now, that might allow him to test well next week, and maybe that we're talking about him a little bit more. But, this is a guy that had a really good year this year for Virginia Tech. I think when you're looking at, the skill set, again, I talk about the balance, but he's really slippery and shifty in the hole. Even though, like, I don't see, like, explosiveness. I just think of him as a really elusive runner. He's got an edge to him on contact as a pass protector and as a runner. I think his vision is pretty solid. I do like him a little bit more in like a gap scheme type of system as opposed to a zone. But I think when you're looking at Tutin, I think he's a specific kind of skill set. But I like him for what he is. A couple guys that I wrote down while watching him. Chase Brown is probably on the high end there, and then Jalen Warren with the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's kind of like a compact, dirty yards runner that's got a little bit of 3-down ability. He can catch the ball out of the backfield, a confident pass catcher. So I think he's more of like your quality role player, like a good number 2 as opposed to a 1. But yeah, I do like Bashal Tutin from Virginia Tech.
It's interesting how many different styles. Like you watch a Damian Martinez from Miami, and that guy is just. I mean, he's huge. He's power. He's probably not breaking away, but he's interesting. I mean, I don't know how much you liked or didn't Trevor Etienne, but like I watched him, I thought. I mean, short area quickness, could catch the ball. It's kind of interesting. I mean, even like a LaQuint Allen from Syracuse who catches a ton of passes. It's just relentless how many different styles of running back there are in this draft. I said at the top that I mean, the quarterback thing, the Vikings have theirs, but I just, because I've watched a little bit of Shedeur. I've watched Cam Ward, Jackson Dart a little bit, and then Tyler Shuck from Louisville. Like, how do you think about this class? Everyone has an opinion. You'll hear the comparisons to last year's class of millions, but I just, as someone who's watched a lot of this tape, how do you feel about this class? Is there a guy you feel like people are lower on than they should be?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's definitely not as good as last year's. I think that when you look at it overall, I'm a believer in Cam Ward. I am excited to see what he brings to his future NFL team. The way that he improved this year in a new situation, a new offense, his third offense in 4 years, right? So he started Incarnate Word for a couple years, went to Washington State, tore up the Pac-12, and then moved out to Miami this past year. And look, this is a guy that if he had come out a year ago, if he had not taken that extra year of eligibility, he would have been a day 3 pick. Probably goes where like Spencer Rattler went, in that last year's draft, but instead goes to Miami. I remember, watching him in the swamp, week 1 against Florida, going on the road and getting a win, and you just saw like the calmness and the poise, but also like the arm talent, the elusiveness. There's a lot to like there with Cam Ward, and so I'm excited to see what he can bring here to his future team. Shedeur Sanders, I do think that he's got starting potential. I would be a little bit nervous taking him as high as what we're talking about. Taking him, I think that there's, especially from like managing a pocket, dealing with pressure, a lot of that stuff is definitely a work in progress, and that can be such a death knell for young quarterbacks, especially if you get thrown in there right away to be put in the fire that way. That can be very tough to deal with and tough to bounce back from. You can develop bad habits. We talked about how often he was sacked over his time at Colorado, and I think that started to show up. Especially as this year went on, his final season, you started to see him like eject from the pocket through the back of the pocket vertically, which that's something that's a cardinal sin for most quarterbacks. Now, if you've got that athleticism to be able to get away with it, sometimes that can be okay. He's not that guy though. He's not a dynamic athlete with the ball in his hands. He's not a superb arm talent. His arm talent's fine, but he's not like a superhuman traits thrower, right? And so I think when you're looking at Shedeur, I think that there is some concern for his projection. To me, you mentioned Tyler Shuck from Louisville. If he became Kirk Cousins in 3 years, like that would be not something that I would be surprised with at all. Like this is a guy that probably like the most like pro style, like your traditional, like, all right, this guy knows how to work a pocket. He attacks the middle of the field. The accuracy, the arm is perfectly fine. But you got to come to grips with the fact that he's a 7th-year senior. Yeah. When he first got to Oregon a few years ago, I mean, he was Justin Herbert's backup at Oregon. That's how long this guy's been in college football. Insane. Yeah, I had a bunch of season-ending injuries. He ended up going to Texas Tech for a couple years. It didn't end well there because of injury. Now, the thing is, it's not like we're dealing with a bunch of shoulder injuries or his left knee was wrecked. I mean, he had like a broken leg. He had like, it was all like kind of weird, like freakish type injuries. Nothing like structural that are chronic, right? And so obviously the medical will be big, but I think when you're looking at Tyler Shuck, you say, all right, like I think that there's something there for him to become a starter. And then Milroe's the wild card from Alabama because the traits are out of this world. The highs are really high. The lows are pretty low, and so you just have to be okay. Give him time, give him patience. What can he be? He's a great kid. Everyone I talk to, and then anything you see with him comes off outstanding. So you feel good when you have high traits with high character to be able to hit that ceiling. But it will take time and patience.
The Tyler Shuck one is so interesting. I remember watching the Senior Bowl from afar, and it's like Tyler Shuck, Shoughh. I'm like, what is going on? Did I forget English? How's this five? And then you're watching him spin it, and you're like, pretty impressive. Like, I watched the Notre Dame tape. I think maybe tape against Clemson, but pretty impressive kind of talent. I'm just always curious to see the machinations of like where guys end up from how they began on the board. I'll kind of end you with this. Is there any guy that you feel like you are just high, like that is just severely underrated? And it doesn't have to be in any of the positions we've mentioned. I mean, even if it's tight end or tackle or anybody that it's like, that's my guy at a level that like I see it and maybe others do not.
It's a player I'm fairly certain that in my first mock draft in January that I mocked to the Vikings.
Really?
So it's actually funny that you asked me. I'm fairly certain that this is who I gave the Vikings in my mock draft. But it would be South Carolina safety Nick Emanwori, 6'3", 227, right? So he is built outstanding for safety, but this is not like some slug on the back end, not like your traditional like box player. This is a freak list athlete, explosive traits, physical gifts are like very apparent as soon as you watch him. Really rangy, covers a ton of ground, and he closes in a blur. Does not get out leveraged on perimeter plays at all, and he has got pop on contact. So all the traits are there, right? And then he goes and he was just so disruptive on the ball this year. Had a bunch of had 4 interceptions. 2 of them he took back to the house for touchdowns. And I talked with some of his South Carolina teammates over the course of the All-Star game process. And I remember I was talking with Tonka Hemingway, one of my favorite names in this draft class. So I was talking with Hemingway down at the Shrine Bowl, and he was like, oh, he puts so much into it. And I was like, all right, well, give me an example. And he was like, well, you saw all the interceptions this year. That didn't happen by accident. I remember in the summer, I was there, I was at the facility, I was getting treatment, whatever it was late at night. He was out on the practice field catching passes on the jugs machine. And we're talking about like a safety, right? Putting in this work to try and get better, from that end of it. And he was like, so to see that, and then to see, like he comes out and he had one of the more productive seasons in the SEC as a cover guy this year. He was a team captain as a true junior. So like the intangibles seem like they're there. The tools are outstanding. 6 interceptions in his final 2 years. He's a guy that I'm extremely high on, and I'm surprised that we're not talking about him as a consensus round 1 guy. But to me, like he's a top 20, top 22, top 25 talent in this class all day long.
My question with him, and I haven't watched enough, like, can he play the deep? Can he play the post? Can he play deep hat? Like, how do you, from a coverage standpoint, and again, I asked this not having watched it, like, how do you feel with him in that regard? I mean, you mentioned that ball production, so that makes sense, but I just, like, movement, like, I'm always thinking, or curious, I guess, in that regard.
Yeah, so they played. There was a lot of too high looks in that defense, and he lined up to the boundary. So there were a lot of times he would get singled up in coverage against whoever the number 2 receiver was on that side. You saw him manned up on running backs, saw him manned up on tight ends. But then there would be times where he had to play in the deep part of the field, and again he showed outstanding range. There was a diving interception, the first play of the Oklahoma game, where you saw him kind of close on the football, and make that play, from depth. And so I think he's got that ability to not just be like a down guy. I think he is like your prototype for today's strong safety in the NFL. But in the same way that Xavier McKinney is, right? And McKinney, I mean, he was outstanding for Green Bay this year, playing from depth and making plays on the ball. The guy that I compared Emanwori to was Kyle Duggar. Kyle Duggar was tearing things up at Lenoir-Rhyne. Ended up going to the Senior Bowl, was really strong there. Went to the combine and blew the doors off the workout. It was one of the better athletic testers. I expect that from Emanwori. Now Duggar turned that into being a 2nd-round pick from Lenoir-Rhyne. So for me, like, I'm watching him on Warrior, I'm like, all right, he's doing this in the SEC, first team All-SEC, he was an All-American this year. Like, I would expect that, if you're going to give him that little bump up, just doing it at that level of competition, my guess is he ends up in round 1.
That's awesome. Question-wise, that's all I had. I appreciate the time, Fran. I know, like I said at the top, but you can see it in the interactive draft guide on All City, just the amount of work that you put in, and it's physical traits, its personality, and I'm sure that stuff will just continue to. You'll pour more in once information comes in from the combine. So appreciate the time, Fran. Thanks for doing it. Looking forward to seeing you in Indianapolis and probably picking your brain too much about guys that intrigue me. Thanks for hopping on, man. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, man. I'm looking forward to it, and I'll see you in a few days.
And that'll do it for episode 60 of the Alec Lewis Show. Appreciate you guys being here. Grateful for Fran Duffy's time. You can tell via his answers and responses and thoughts to certain draft some of the players, how much work he puts in. I mean, 8 tapes. Like, I hope you guys know that's about 75 plays on average times 8. So we're talking probably close to 600 plays on specific players that he has watched. And that's a lot of work. That's a lot of time. That's a lot of energy. That's a lot of Red Bull or coffee or whatever the drink of choice is for any of us, including Fran. So appreciate him hopping on and providing some of his insight. As I mentioned, his draft guide is going to be in the description. I didn't tell him that I would do that. It's just a phenomenal interactive draft guide that I've enjoyed kind of following and reading over the course of time. So that'll do it. Like I said, for episode 60, please, if you're watching on YouTube for the first time and you made it all this way, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening on Apple, Spotify, you can rate, review, and do all that good stuff. But we will be back next week from Indianapolis at the Combine with information galore. Talk to you guys next week. Have a great weekend. See you guys on the flip side.